Good morning, friends. My name is Sandi. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm the youngest of 4 kids and the only girl. If you look at my siblings and I, you'd see some similarities, but I'm different from my brothers in a lot of ways. My older brothers all played tennis, ran cross country, joined the jazz band, went to college for 4 years to finish a degree in computer science, got married, and had kids. Me, on the other hand, I joined a 4-H club, rode horses, took art class, transferred between colleges, and changed my major, rarely following the trail they'd blazed. I wasn't much like my brothers. And I was different than my friends, too. They'd be talking over lunch about who liked who or the latest anime, and I'd be sitting in the library reading Confessions of St. Augustine. Sometimes I liked feeling different, but often I tried to blend in and just hide my weirdness. A song called One and Lonely expresses both feelings well. Sometimes I have good days, and it's good to be me. Sometimes I get the best of insecurity. And it's quite all right to be the one and only. But today, I feel like the one and lonely. And I had a good number of one and lonely days. And on those days, I'd laugh at the jokes I didn't get and talk about a hit TV show as though I'd actually seen an episode. Because I didn't like feeling different. I'm talking about me. I was talking about myself, but my topic today is the me of me, you, and we, the theme of our time together. So let's take a quick survey. You can raise your hand, and it's super safe because I can't see you. If you always like yourself and are glad that you're just the way you are all of the time, raise your hand. And I'm guessing not many hands are up right now. If I asked how many of you have felt different, like you don't belong, or like you're not good enough, I think I'd have a lot more responses. Somehow, it seems we often don't like being ourselves. One thing I do like about myself is that I'm a storyteller. So today, I'd like to share with you a story that speaks about God's design for our individual characteristics and life events. The story is that of Esther. Esther might not have liked being herself either. She was a Jew who lived about 500 years before Jesus, when the Jewish people had been forcibly deported and scattered throughout the Persian Empire. Esther's parents had died, so she grew up in her uncle Mordecai's house in a city named Susa. Before where we'll pick up the story, the Persian king named Xerxes had gotten angry with the queen when she didn't obey him. Then he decided to replace the queen. And the way Xerxes went about it was to proclaim that beautiful young women from his kingdom be taken into his harem, he'd check them out, and then whichever of these women pleased him the most would be the new queen. And Esther was one of those young women. It might sound like an honor to be chosen by the king, but it meant she was forcibly taken away from the family she had left and taken to live in a strange place. There was no guarantee she would be queen either. She might spend her life as one of many women in a harem, and I could imagine resenting being a woman at that point. On top of that, Mordecai had warned Esther not to tell anyone she was a Jew. Anti-Semitism was alive and well back then too. So for Esther's safety, it was better for her to stay quiet about her family and culture. You could say it's an example of intersectionality, or you could simply say it's 2 strikes against Esther, that she was a woman and a Jew. And then the story gets worse. There's an advisor to King Xerxes named Haman. Haman was in a high enough position that other officials would kneel before him to honor him. However, Mordecai refused to do this. Some of the other officials less than helpfully pointed out to Haman that Mordecai refused to honor him, and Haman was enraged. I'll pick up the story here in Esther 3:6 and read a section from the New Living Translation. Haman had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. So in the month of April, during the 12th year of King Xerxes' reign, lots were cast in Haman's presence, and the lots were called Purim, to determine the best day and month to take action. The practice of casting lots is something like throwing dice to make a decision. So the day selected was March 7th, nearly a year later. Then Haman approached King Xerxes and said, "There's a certain race of people scattered through all the provinces of your empire who keep themselves separate from everyone else. Their laws are different from those of any other people, and they refuse to obey the laws of the king. So it is not in the king's interest to let them live. If it please the king, issue a decree that they be destroyed, and I will give 10,000 large sacks of silver to the government administrators to be deposited in the royal treasury." The king agreed, confirming his decision by removing the signet ring from his finger and giving it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said, "The money and the people are both yours to do with as you see fit." So with the full authority of the king, Haman writes this terrible decree that all the Jews be killed, and their property would go to the people killing them. Because she was born a Jew, Esther is given a death sentence along with all of her relatives. The Jews were different, and different was bad. Now, most of the time in America, being ourselves won't get us killed, and I'm glad of that. Still, we might feel like being unique is bad and try to hide that we're different, the way Esther hid her ethnicity. We might feel like God wouldn't use us, since we're ordinary people without special skills or status. It would have been easy for Esther to think that. As a woman in that time, she was barely thought of as better than a cow or horse. What could God possibly do with her? But after Haman issues this order that all Jews are going to be killed, Mordecai sends word to Esther. By that time, Esther had actually been chosen to be queen, but it turned out that still didn't give her much power. The story continues in chapter 4, verse 7, when Esther has sent a messenger, Hathach, to talk to Mordecai. Mordecai told the messenger Hathach the whole story, including the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai gave Hathach a copy of the decree issued in Susa, that's their city, that called for the death of all Jews. And he asked Hathach to show it to Esther and explain the situation to her. And he also asked Hathach to direct her to go to the king and beg for mercy and plead for her people. So Hathach returned to Esther with Mordecai's message. Then Esther told Hathach to go back and relay this message to Mordecai. All the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. So Hathach gave Esther's message to Mordecai. And Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. Esther's a woman, so she had no power. And she's a Jew, so she's under a death sentence. But where she could easily look at how God made her and conclude that there must be some mistake and God wouldn't use her, Mordecai sees an opportunity. Because she's a woman, she was brought into the king's palace. And because she's a Jew, she's uniquely able to plead the cause of the rest of the Jews. Esther could have seen how she was different as a mistake or a weakness. But here Mordecai suggests that it is those same traits that create an opportunity for God to use her. And God does use her. Esther starts off from her role as a woman. She dresses up and she throws a dinner party. She invites the king, along with Haman. When she serves the king, he asks, "Tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I'll give it to you, even if it is half the kingdom." And Queen Esther replied, "If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who'd kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king." "Who would do such a thing?" King Xerxes demanded. "Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you?" And Esther replied, This wicked Haman is our adversary and enemy. And Haman ends up being killed, but the Jews are not. They end up better off than ever. It turns out God had an amazing plan in all the details of Esther's life. Who Esther was and how her life played out had been set up by God. And this is also what God does with me and with you. We are not accidents or rejects, any one of us. God designed us with care, just like he did Esther. He put together the blend of characteristics, personality, physical body, and soul that make us. Paul speaks of us as God's masterpieces. In Psalms, David praises God for how you knit me together in my mother's womb. Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. Your workmanship is marvelous, how well I know it. It sounds so nice and simple when I say it like that. In reality, it looks messier. I mean, you look great and all, but me? Can I really turn it like Esther to see the opportunities and strengths God gave me and how he designed me? It's easy to be hard on myself when I'm reminded I'm not the same as the people around me. When I'm with free-spirited friends, I can easily think I'm too nerdy, too organized. Or other times I can decide that I'm too creative for structures and logic and I don't fit in any spot. I could stop there and give up. Or I can see how God can transform those. I can choose to let God work in me exactly how he designed me. One day I can bring together design and organization into spreadsheets. Then another day, write or draw something to creatively encourage a friend. I can adapt and find connections in many environments. Now, let's switch and let you take a turn for a second. I want you to think of a personality characteristic you aren't fond of about yourself. See if you can think of how it can be a strength. For example, mule-headed or stubborn can become persistent. If you're daring, you can type the positive version into chat. I believe that should still work while we're doing a screen share. And I'd enjoy seeing what you come up with. Now, there's an important distinction I want to make here. This isn't just a talk about the power of positive thinking. All these things that make us ourselves can be good. What makes them a gift instead of a curse isn't a better choice of words. It's recognizing God's design in them and letting him work in them. For example, arrogance isn't pretty. God can transform arrogance into confidence and a leadership gift. But arrogance can remain arrogance too. You can call arrogance nice things and dress it up in pretty words. But God is the one who can transform the person and help them be all that he created them to be. God designed us for good, but without his help, we'll never see just how good he made them to be. So let me quickly contrast two characters to illustrate this. The first is Gideon, an early leader in Israel whose story is told in Judges. An angel appears to him and tells him to rescue Israel from the people oppressing them. Gideon replies, "How can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I'm the least in my entire family." Gideon really wasn't sure God would use him because he was born a nobody. But Gideon asks to confirm that this is God who's leading him, and then he obeys the first thing God asks him to do. And Gideon asks again if God is really going to use him, and God confirms it again, so Gideon obeys. It goes on like this, and Gideon ends up confidently executing a rather crazy plan to defeat the invaders. Gideon follows God with his fear and all, and God uses him in a powerful way, like he did Esther. Then our counterexample is Saul, the first king in Israel who came a bit later than Gideon. A prophet tells Saul that he's going to be king. Saul replies, "I'm only from the tribe of Benjamin, the smallest tribe in Israel, and my family is the least important of all the families of that tribe. Why are you talking to me like this?" His response sounds a lot like Gideon. He's also unsure that God could use him because of who he was. But then the stories diverge. Despite a couple confirmations that God has indeed spoken, Saul doesn't follow God's instructions. Saul hides. He lets fear and his perception of who he is control him instead of letting God work in him. And Saul continues to act out his insecurity, eventually trying to murder the person who God calls to be the next king. And this is the difference between bringing ourselves to God and letting God work in us, or not. It makes a big difference if we're able to live the good life God intends for us. Of course, it'd be a lot easier for me to live how God meant for me if my life had gone differently, right? On the one hand, there's how God designed me, but then there's all this stuff that happens in life. There are hard things that come our way, leaving us with baggage and scars. Esther got ripped away from her family and shoved in a harem. What about that junk? And God can also use these. Romans 8:28 affirms, "We know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them." That isn't saying that awful things are good, or that God wanted you to suffer. What it is saying is that no matter what has happened or what choice you made, God can work out his plans and bring good. You can let him transform these life experiences the same way you can invite him into your characteristics. Beyond Esther, the classic Bible example of God working for good out of bad is Joseph. His brothers hated him and sold him as a slave. Then Joseph's owner threw Joseph into prison on false charges. From outward appearances, Joseph's life stunk. But that didn't mean God wasn't working. Because in prison, Joseph meets someone who eventually helps Joseph become second in command in Egypt and save his family from a famine. God worked toward good things in Joseph's life. Can you think of a way God has brought good for you or through you in the situations of your life? Your story doesn't have to be as dramatic as Joseph's or Esther's. Maybe losing a job helped you find a new passion. Or maybe you got through a tough time and ended with deep, solid friendships built during that pain. God plans for good in your life history as well. To bring this into modern times, in the business world, there are conversations about how to get employees to bring their whole selves to work. Leaders want people to be willing to share their unique strengths and their life experiences, because that diversity brings more possibilities for the company. It's interesting to see that in business, but where we desperately need it is the church. Lisa and Marianne will be talking more about how our diversity brings benefits to others in our later two talks. But it starts by recognizing I'm unique, and different is part of God's good design. Empowered by God, I can contribute in a way no one else can. We can bring our whole selves to God. God wants to work with all of me and all of you. It seems like God cares whether or not we're inviting him into all the parts of who we are or what has happened to us. At least in my life, I've seen a significant difference between times I've been open and actively seeking God's work in specific areas of my life and the times where I'm passively sitting back, assuming God will do his thing eventually. Now, it's easier to invite God into things we recognize as strength, like, say, it's easy to say that musical talent or world travel could be used by God, and harder to do with things we'd think of as weaknesses, like ADHD or a relationship that went badly. It's hard to imagine God would want to have anything to do with those. But this is what Esther shows us. God worked in the things that the world thinks of as weaknesses, her gender, her minority status, and some life events that were downright lousy, to work out something amazing. We can bring all that we are and all that we've been through to God for him to bring good out of. So let me pray for us. Creator God, who made each of us, come and speak to each of the women listening right now. Speak to each one of us about the way you have designed us and how you are working for good in our lives. The design you put in us when we were born and the way you have worked in the events that have played out in our lives since then. Help us to invite you into all of those spaces and help us to see the way you would like to work in them and join you in what you're doing in our lives. In your name, Lord, amen. I was born different, uniquely me. I'm not like my brothers and I'm not like my friends. Life has happened to me in a way that it hasn't happened to any of you. God could have made us the same, but he didn't, because he has something better in mind. I can grow to see God's design in who I am, and I can let him bring good out of my life experiences. I hope that Esther's story has helped you to think about God's design in who you are and how your life has played out. God made you to be a masterpiece. And I'd invite you to continue to think and pray about this, especially next time you're feeling like a one and lonely instead of the one and only.